There is a moment in the fall of 1882 that the old people of Cedar Ford, Kansas still talked about 40 years later, and it happened under the lanterns of Ephraim Hollis's great red barn on the night of the harvest dance, when a rancher named Gideon Rourke walked the whole length of that floor past two of the prettiest girls in the county. Both of them already rising from the bench with their ribbons trembling, and stopped in front of the big woman standing alone against the wall. The one the young men had been laughing at all evening. The one somebody had just called, loud enough for half the barn to hear. The fat sister. He took off his hat. He held out his hand, and the fiddle player, Old Man Spears, who had seen everything a fiddle player sees in 30 years of barn dances, said afterward that the room went so quiet you could hear the lantern wicks burning. But to understand what that moment cost, and what it set in motion, and why, 2 winters later, every family in that valley would owe their full bellies to the very woman they had laughed at. You have to go back to the beginning, back to a quarter section of bottomland on the Solomon River, where a Danish settler named Lars Jensen was raising 3 daughters alone. Lars had come out from Wisconsin in 1871 with a wagon, a plow, a wife named Karen, and a belief, common to Danes and to farmers, and doubly common to Danish farmers, that work was a form of prayer. He proved up his homestead in the grasshopper years, when half the county gave up and rolled back east, and he did it in large part because Karen Jensen was the kind of woman who could make a supper out of nothing and a smokehouse out of a dugout, and because their eldest daughter, Marta, was the kind of child who watched her mother's hands the way other children watched the candy jar at the store. Karen died of a fever in the spring of 1876, when Marta was 19, Ingrid was 16, and little Sophie was 10, and from that season forward the Jensen kitchen belonged to Marta, and so did the garden, and the henyard, and the hog pen, and the low sod smokehouse her mother had built into the creek bank, and so, in every way that mattered, did the raising of her 2 sisters. Now it must be said plainly, because the whole story turns on it, and because Marta herself never pretended otherwise. Marta Jensen was fat. Not plump, not sturdy, not big-boned the way kind aunts say it. She was a big woman, a genuinely large woman, broad through the shoulder and broad through the hip, with heavy arms and a round, open face and a soft double chin. And by the time she was 20, she weighed 290 pounds, and by the harvest of 1882, she weighed more than that, and there was not a scale in Cedar Ford she cared to stand on to learn the number exactly. She had been a heavy child of a heavy mother, and the years of famous Jensen cooking had done what they did, and that was simply the fact of her. The way the river was a fact, and the wind was a fact. What the town made of that fact is the shameful part of this story, and what Marta made of it is the glorious part, and we will get to both. But first, you should see her the way the land saw her, because the land had no opinion about her waistline, and the land is a fair judge. The land saw a woman who was up before 4 in dark of winter and light of summer alike, who milked, fed, hauled, chopped, kneaded, rendered, scrubbed, and salted from that hour until full dark. The land saw a woman who could pitch hay off a wagon steady as a man and butcher a hog from squeal to sausage with nothing wasted but the noise, as the old joke had it. Though when Marta said the old joke, she said it soft, because she did not like waste, not even wasted noise. Her mother had taught her the kitchen, but it was her mother's father, old Soren, back in Denmark, who had taught her mother. And he had been a farm butcher in Jutland, a man who traveled from farm to farm every November with his knives rolled in oiled canvas, and the craft had come down through Karen's hands into Marta's hands entire, the way a language comes down. She had learned brines the way other girls learned hymns. She knew the difference between the coarse gray salt you cured with and the fine white salt you set on the table, and why the one worked and the other failed, and she knew it not as a rule, but as a reason. She knew how long a ham the size of a church Bible wanted to lie in cure in a warm November, and how much longer in a cold one, and she could tell by pressing her thumb into the meat whether the salt had walked all the way to the bone, and if you asked her how she knew, She would look at you with those calm gray eyes and say that her thumb knew. And that was all the answer you would get, because it was all the answer there was. She could render lard so clean and so white that Mrs. Prucha, the Bohemian widow on the next quarter, once held a crock of it up to the window and said it looked like snow that had decided to behave. She made rye bread on Saturdays, 12 loaves at a burning, in the brick oven Lars had built her the year she turned 16. And the smell of it went down the river road like a rumor, and it is recorded in the minutes of the Cedar Ford Grange, you can look, that her bread took the premium at the county fair 3 years running, listed each year under the name L. Jensen, because Lars entered it for her and she never corrected the card. That was Marta. She did the work and let the credit drift where it liked. And here's the thing the town never understood, the thing that makes the mockery so bitter to tell. She was not a sad woman. The picture everybody wants, the fat girl crying into her apron by lamplight, is a lie, or mostly a lie, and the part of it that is true she kept so private that not even Sophie, who loved her best, saw it more than twice in her life. Marta Jensen liked her days. She liked the heat of the oven on her face and the cold of the smokehouse on her arms, liked the feel of a clean knife and proofing dough in a full cellar in October, the way a banker likes a full ledger. She laughed easily, a low, comfortable laugh you could warm your hands at, and she sang Danish songs to the hogs because, she said, a calm hog makes sweet pork, and whether that is science or not, her pork was the sweetest in the township, so nobody could argue. She had, besides all that, a mind that ran ahead like a good dog. She read the almanac in the county paper and her mother's Danish receipt book with its brown ink going pale, and she kept her own book beside it, a fat gray ledger bought off a peddler, where she wrote down everything, frost dates, brine measures, what the hens did, what the sky did, what worked, and what failed, and why, in a small, square, upright hand. Her father called that book Marta's Bible, and he was not being entirely funny when he said it. If you had asked the men loafing on the porch of Pratt's store what they knew about Marta Jensen, though, you would have heard none of this. You would have heard about her size, and then you would have heard about her size again, told a different way, and then, if the afternoon was long and the checkers were dull, you would have heard about her size a third time. Because a small town that has decided to find a person funny is the least inventive audience on earth. She was the fat Jensen girl. That was the whole of her as far as the porch was concerned. Her sisters, now the porch had more to say about, and set it with its hat off. Ingrid at 22 was slender as a willow switch, and knew it, with their mother's pale hair and a laugh she had practiced until it rang like a little bell, and Sophie at 16 was turning the same way, lighter and sweeter and easier. And the young men of Cedar Ford came up the Jensen lane on Sunday afternoons the way crows come to a cornfield, in 2s and 3s, hats in their laps, drinking coffee Marta had made and eating cake Marta had baked, complimenting Ingrid on the lightness of it. And Ingrid would smile and let the compliment sit there, unreturned to its rightful owner, and Marta would stand in the doorway, and she filled the doorway, and she would ask if anybody wanted more cream, and nobody would quite look at her when they said yes. Understand, the town was not a wicked town. Cedar Ford in 1882 was 200 and some souls, a mill, a church, a school, a smithy, 2 saloons that scowled at each other across the width of Main Street, Pratt's General Store, the land office, the livery, and the depot, all of it 10 years old and proud of itself, full of people who would pull your wagon out of a slough in the rain and sit up 3 nights with your sick child. But a town is like a person. It has habits it does not examine, and one of its habits was laughing at Marta Jensen, and the habit had gone so deep that most of them no longer knew they were doing it, any more than a man knows he is breathing. The joke was just there, part of the furniture of the place. It sat on the porch at Pratt's. It stood at the bar in both saloons. It even, God forgive them, sat in a pew or 2 on Sunday. And every town joke has its high priest, and in Cedar Ford that office was held by a young man named Roy Callum. Roy was the son of Horace Callum, who ran the land office and held paper on half the quarter sections in the township, and Roy had grown up with the two things that ruin a young man fastest: money he had not earned, and laughter he had not earned, for he was quick and he was handsome, and he had learned early that the fastest way to gather a crowd is to set fire to somebody standing at the edge of it. He was 23 that fall, wore a store-bought coat, ran his father's errands, and called it business. And he had, for reasons no one ever fathomed, because Marta Jensen had never done him the smallest harm, made her his particular study. It was Roy who named the Jensen wagon the Fairy. It was Roy who asked, the winter she was 19, whether the river froze thicker on the Jensen side, and got his laugh, and pocketed it, and came back for more. Little coins of cruelty, spent easy, and the porch always made change. And Marta bore it the way she bore August heat, as weather, as a thing that was simply in the country she lived in. Only once did Sophie see the cost. She was 12 that time, and she had come out to the smokehouse at first light for the egg basket and found her eldest sister standing with both hands flat on the salt barrel and her eyes shut, and tears on her face, silent. And Sophie stood rooted, and Marta opened her eyes and saw her and said, in her ordinary voice, that salt stings where the skin is cracked, and went on with her work. And Sophie, who was young, but not a fool, never told a living soul until she was an old woman telling the whole of this story to her grandchildren, when Marta was past being stung by anything. This, then, was the standing of things in the Valley of the Solomon in the last good summer before the hard years, a summer of full rain and heavy wheat. Lars Jensen's quarter was thriving. His daughters were the ornament and the joke of the township by turns. And 6 miles north of the river, on the high ground where the Bluestem ran to the sky, there was a ranch, the biggest in that corner of Kansas, 7,000 acres of grass and nearly 3,000 head of cattle, and it belonged to a man named Gideon Rourke, and it is time you met him, because the story has been waiting on him, the way the whole barn would wait on him, holding its breath on the night of the harvest dance. Gideon Rourke was 34 years old that summer, and he had been in the valley 11 years, and in all 11 of them no one in Cedar Ford had ever gotten a full sentence out of him that he did not think the occasion strictly required. He was a tall man, wide in the shoulder and lean everywhere else, with dark hair going early to iron at the temples, a short beard he kept trimmed, and a way of standing still that made other men feel they were fidgeting even when they were not. He had come up the trail from Texas at 23 with a saddle, a bedroll, and 4 years of war orphaned wandering behind him that he never discussed, had hired on with the old Ballard outfit. And when Ballard's heart quit in a line shack in the winter of 1875, it was discovered that the silent Texan had been paid partly in heifers for 3 years by private arrangement, and that he owned, free and clear, the beginnings of a herd. What he built from that beginning he built the way a river builds a valley, slowly, without noise, and without asking permission. By 1882, the Rourke brand ran on close to 3,000 head. He employed 8 riders in summer, and for the year round he had built a low-stone ranch house with his own hands and a barn bigger than the church. And he owed no man a dollar, which in a county where Horace Callum's land office held paper on half of everything made him a kind of walking rebuke, and Horace Callum felt it, and so, in his sneering inherited way, did Roy. The town could not laugh at Gideon Rourke, so it gossiped about him instead, and what it gossiped was always the same question, which was why such a man with such a spread had no wife in that stone house. Mothers had run their daughters past him at socials for a decade the way horse dealers run colts past a buyer, and he had been courteous, and he had been brief. And he had ridden home alone every time, and the town had long ago decided he was simply made of the same stone as his house, and the town, as usual with Gideon, was wrong. The truth, which he told exactly one person in his life, and she will come into this story presently, was that Gideon Rourke had spent his boyhood watching his father, a laughing, charming, handsome man, court and win, and then slowly starve the heart of his mother, a plain, heavy, tireless woman who ran their hill farm like a clock, while her husband was witty in town, and he had buried his mother at 14, worn out at 40, and stood at the grave watching his father accept condolences gracefully. And something in the boy had shut like a gate. What he carried out of that boyhood was a distrust of charm so deep it was nearly a religion, and a private, unbudging conviction formed at an age when convictions go all the way down, that the worth of a person is the work of their hands and the steadiness of their word, and that prettiness is to worth as paint is to timber. He was not a man who disliked beauty. He was a man who had watched beauty be treated as payment, and had seen what it bought, and wanted no part of the transaction. Now, the first time Gideon Rourke took particular notice of Marta Jensen, neither of them was young, as the country counted it, and nothing about the occasion would make a story for a Valentine, because it happened at the counter of Pratt's store over a barrel of spoiled salt. It was the fall of 1881, a full year before the dance, and Gideon had come in to settle his winter order. And ahead of him at the counter stood a very large young woman in a clean gray dress, and Aldous Pratt was telling her that the salt was the salt. That salt was salt, and what difference could it make? Marta had a handful of it out on the counter, and she was not raising her voice, which was the first thing Gideon noticed, because he was a man who did not raise his. And she said that this was fine solar salt, kettle-boiled and quick to dissolve and fit for the table and for butter, and that what she had ordered and what her barrel was marked as was coarse rock salt, slow salt, curing salt, and that if she packed her pork in this, the cure would race the spoilage and lose in the deep of a ham, where you could not see the loss until February opened it, and the loss opened with it, and she said it the way an engineer says a bridge will not carry the load, without heat, and Pratt shuffled and said nobody else in the township complained, and Marta said, still mild, that nobody else in the township was putting down 14 hogs, and that if he liked she would bring him one of her hams at Christmas and one cured in his fine wrong salt at the same time, and he could sell tickets to the difference. Gideon Rourke laughed. Out loud, once, a short sound rusty with disuse, and both of them turned, because neither had heard it before, and most of Cedar Ford would have told you it did not occur. And Marta looked at this tall, grave, famous, silent man, laughing at her joke, not at her, at her joke, and she noted the difference the way she noted everything, and she put her spoiled salt back in the barrel, and she got her right salt. Because Pratt, outnumbered, dug the proper barrel out of the back room, and she nodded to them both and hauled it out to the wagon herself before either man thought to offer, and that was the whole of it. But Gideon stood at that counter and made his winter order with half his mind, because the other half was watching the Jensen wagon roll off down Main Street and thinking that in 11 years in that county, through droughts and deals and threshing rings and funerals, he had heard maybe 5 people speak about their work with that particular calm command, and all 5 had been old men. And not one of them had been laughed at by an entire town, and he found, examining the thing in his slow way over the following weeks, that the laughing had begun to sit crooked with him, like a stone in a boot, and that at the mercantile and the mill and along the road his ear had begun, without instruction, to pick her name out of the general noise, and to keep a ledger of its own on what the noise said, and who said it, and what, in 11 years, any of the Sayers had ever built. So understand that when the famous night came, it did not come from nowhere. Nothing in this story comes from nowhere. The town only thought it did, because the town had never once watched Gideon Rourke watch anything. That winter and the spring and summer that followed, the watching went on, in the sideways fashion of a man who does not know yet what he is doing, or does not admit it. Gideon found reasons. He bought 2 of Lars Jensen's hogs in February and drove out for them himself, a thing he could have sent a rider to do, and stood in the cold by the sod smokehouse while Marta showed him the hams hanging in their clean brown rows in the dark, and the smell in that little house was oak smoke and sweetness and order, and he asked one question about the cure and got an answer with 15 years of reasons folded quietly inside it, and drove home with his hogs in a silence that had a new furniture in it. He took to attending the Grange meetings, which he had always avoided, and if the fat gray ledger came out of Marta's basket when the talk ran to feed or frost, he was watching the faces that smirked at it and filing them. There was a church supper in June where a table leg gave and a whole board of pies started to go, and Marta, nearest, caught the board flat on both forearms and held it, 40 pounds of pie level as a shelf, while the men scrambled for the trestle. And she laughed her low laugh and said something in Danish to the pies as if scolding them for jumping. And the crowd laughed with her for once and not at her. For 3 seconds the world as it ought to have been, and then Roy Callum, from the back, said, "Well, boys, the table never had a chance against her," and got his coins, and the world went back. Gideon was at that supper. He did not laugh at either joke. He stood by the lemonade with his hat in his hand and watched Marta's face do the thing it did. The small setting of the mouth. The eyes going flat calm like water when the wind quits. The choosing, visible to anyone who troubled to look, simply to go on, and he set that beside 11 years of the porch at Pratt's, and something in the tall, quiet man finished adding itself up. But because he was who he was, he did nothing yet. He was a man who moved on his own seasons. The town would learn that. The whole county would learn it on a Saturday night in October under the lanterns, all at once. Harvest came on early and heavy that year. The wheat had filled fat on June rain, and by the middle of July the whole valley was the color of a fresh biscuit. And the threshing ring formed up the way it did every year. 14 farms pooling their sweat, Hollis's steam thresher snorting from quarter to quarter, with its crew of neighbors swelling and shrinking around it, and with the ring, as always, came the other machine, the one that ran on wood smoke and lard and got no mention in the county paper, the cook line. Beating a threshing crew is a species of warfare, and anyone who has done it will tell you so with a straight face. 30, 40 men, sunburnt and chaff-itched, coming to the tables twice a day with the appetite of a prairie fire, and the reputation of every farm in the ring riding on what its women set before them, because a threshing crew is also a jury, and its verdicts carry from one end of a county to the other and last for years. The Jensen quarter fed on the second Thursday, and men had been known to trade places in the ring order to be on the machine that day. It was not Ingrid's coffee they traded for. That year, Marta fed 41 men off plank tables under the cottonwoods, fried chicken and ham and new potatoes and cucumber pickles and light bread and 3 kinds of pie, and she did it with the composed, unhurried command of a colonel who has already won, every dish landing full and hot, every space refilled before it was empty. And Gideon Rourke, who had thrown in with the ring that season for the first time, trading the loan of 4 good horses for help with his hay, sat at the end of a plank bench and ate and watched the operation the way he would have watched another man work cattle professionally. And what he concluded, he kept where he kept everything. But it was at the Hollis place, 2 days later, that the valley got its plainest look at what Marta Jensen was, and being the valley, it looked straight at the thing and saw nothing. The Hollis kitchen caught fire at 10:30 in the morning on feeding day. Grease, an overfull firebox, a gust down the stovepipe, no one ever settled it, but the result was a kitchen full of smoke, a stove ruined for the day. The better part of the crew's dinner scorched past saving, and Delia Hollis standing in her dooryard with her apron over her face, while 40 men and the hungriest machine in Kansas bore down on noon with nothing to meet it. It was Marta, come over with the Jensen wagon to help serve, who took hold. She did not shout. Witnesses disagreed afterward about whether she even raised her voice. She stood in that smoking dooryard for the length of 10 breaths, so still that Delia thought she had gone simple, and what she was doing in those 10 breaths was reading her inventory the way a general reads a map. And then she began to speak, quietly, in lists, and the dooryard began to move. The wash boiler was scoured and set over the fire pit for coffee. 2 hams came down out of the Hollis smokehouse, and her knife had them sliced thin as hymn book pages before the fire was fairly going under the borrowed griddles. Sophie went up the road at a run for the Jensen Saturday loaves, all 12, and for every egg Mrs. Prucha could spare. Boys were set to splitting stovewood for the pit, girls to hauling water and grinding coffee, and Ingrid, to her credit, and Marta always gave it to her. Fried eggs over an open fire for an hour without one complaint about her hem. At noon, when the machine sighed down and the men came across the stubble slapping chaff out of their shirts, they sat down under the cottonwoods to hot coffee, griddled fried ham, eggs, fried bread and ham grease, and cold pie carried in from 3 farms. And most of them never learned till sundown that there had been a fire at all, and the ones who knew swore the dinner beat the one they had been promised. Ephraim Hollis stood at the head of the table and said, "Lord, we thank thee." And then he said, "And we thank Marta Jensen," which was as close to a public honor as she had gotten in her life, and the crew banged their cups. And for a minute the cottonwood shade was a good place to be a big woman who knew her work. And then, because this valley was that valley, a voice from down the board said, not quite low enough, that it was no wonder she could feed 40 men in an hour. Look what she trained on. And the cups went quiet a half-beat too late, and the minute was over. The voice was not Roy Callum's this time. It was one of his echoes, a hired man off the Callum sections, because a joke like Roy's joke never stays with its owner. It spreads out into a county like bindweed, and that is the true poison of it, and the man who planted it was not even present to be ashamed. If shame was a thing, he did. Gideon Rourke was present. He was 3 places down the plank, and what he did has been remembered because of everything that came after, though at the time it seemed only strange. He stood up in the quiet with his plate in his hand, walked the length of the table, and sat down again directly across from Marta Jensen, folding his long frame onto the board like a man taking a pew, and said to her, in a voice no louder than passing the salt, but heard, somehow, to the end of the boards, that he had eaten in cow camps and cook cars and hotels in 3 states, and this was the best meal he could remember, and he would be obliged if she would tell him how the coffee was made so his own cook could fail at it properly. That was all. It does not sound like much, told now. But a public table reads a thing like that the way it reads a brand on a hide, and what it read was that the biggest cattleman in the county had just crossed a length of plank and set himself down, before witnesses, on Marta Jensen's side of a joke, and the hired man studied his pie, and the talk started up again about the wheat, and Marta, who understood exactly what had been done. Because she understood everything that happened at a table, told him how the coffee was made, eggshells and all, in her calm receipt book voice, and if her ears were red, well, the fire pit was near, and a big woman runs warm, and no one could prove a thing. It was in the last week of the threshing, with the stacks up and the grain hauled and the whole valley feeling rich and loose the way it does just once a year, that the notice went up at Pratt's store and the church door both, hand-lettered by the schoolteacher, Miss Eudora Finch, whose penmanship was the pride of the district. Harvest Dance, Saturday, the 7th of October, at the Hollis Barn, all the township invited. Supper at 9. Music by Mr. Spears and his sons, come one, come all. It was the great social fixture of the valley's year, bigger than the fair, bigger than Christmas, the one night the whole scattered township stood in one warm room and looked at itself. And in the Jensen house that notice landed the way it landed every year, which is to say differently, in each of 3 hearts. Sophie, 16 now and asked for the first time by the Olson boy before the notice was 2 days old, floated. Ingrid entered the season of her great annual generalship, for the harvest dance was her capital and her exchange, and she had run the arithmetic of partners and rivals before the flour was off the notice board. And Marta baked. She would go, of course. She went every year. She sat with the wives and the grandmothers on the benches along the north wall. She kept an eye on the little ones asleep in the hay of the end stalls. She helped lay the supper out at 9 and clear it after, and once. Sometimes twice in an evening, her father would come and dance her around the floor in his stiff, kindly, wooden way, because Lars Jensen was many good things, but graceful was not among them, and that would be the whole of her dancing. And she would ride home at 2 in the morning with her feet aching less than anyone's in the wagon, and never say so. 19 years old, 22, 25. Dance after dance after dance, and no man outside her blood had ever once crossed the floor for her. She knew what the evening was. She went anyway, every year, with her head up and a cake in her arms, and if you want to know what kind of courage that is, ask anyone who has ever been the joke of a small town, and they will tell you it is the kind you have to raise fresh every time, like bread. The week before the dance, the Jensen house ran on two economies. Upstairs was the economy of ribbon. Ingrid's dress, sprigged lawn with a new velvet sash the color of chokecherries, had been planned since August and fitted 3 times, and Sophie's blue was let out at the shoulder and taken in at the waist and pressed until the iron side. And the upstairs air was all hot flattern and rosewater and the particular silvery quarreling of sisters who love each other over a shared looking-glass. Downstairs was the economy of butter. The supper at 9, by long custom, was laid on by the township together, every farm sending its best, and the unspoken tournament inside that custom was as fierce as anything the young men did on horseback. Marta baked for 3 days. She sent 2 hams from the spring smoking, boiled and glazed with her mother's brown sugar and mustard glaze, a great crock of her white beans baked with molasses and salt pork, 6 rye loaves and 6 white, a stack of ginger cakes tall as a churn, and the cake she was known for, the one the receipt book called Karen's cake, 4 layers, cardamom in the crumb, wild plum jelly and sweet cream between. And she packed it all in straw in the wagon bed like a woman's shipping glass, and if you had told her that strangers would remember that supper 40 years on, she would have said that was the general idea. For herself she made over her good dress the deep blue wool bought 3 winters back, and she did it at night, after the baking, by lamp, letting out what needed letting and setting in a collar of white lace her mother had carried from Denmark, and she looked at herself a long moment in the little glass when it was done. A big woman in a good dress. And she said something to the glass in Danish that Sophie, listening through the wall, could not make out, and the tone of it was not sad and not hopeful, it was level. The tone of a woman taking inventory before winter, and then the lamp went out. It is worth knowing, for what came later, that Gideon Rourke almost did not go. He had not gone in 6 years. His riders went, the whole crew, scrubbed and shaved and gone by 4 in the afternoon, and the boss stayed on the ranch with the stock and his books and liked it, or told himself he did. That afternoon he worked the corrals until there was nothing honest left to do, and washed, and stood in his stone kitchen in the falling light with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. And what he was thinking no man knows, because he never said. But his foreman, Tom Rias, riding back at midnight for a forgotten flask, met the boss on the river road, mounted in his good black coat, riding toward the lights and the far-off fiddle music like a man riding toward a thing he had put off too long. And Tom, being wise, touched his hat and said nothing. Then or ever. The Hollis barn stood a quarter mile off the river on the benchland, red as a rooster, big as a steamboat, and that night it was the brightest thing in Kansas. Every lantern in 4 townships hung from its beams. The cut hay was swept back to the walls, the floor was waxed with candle shavings and cornmeal, and by full dark the wagons were parked in the stubble 100 deep, and the barn was a box of gold light and fiddle music sitting out on the dark prairie like something dropped from another world. And inside it was the whole warm breathing world of that county packed shoulder to shoulder, wheat money in the men's pockets and summer's end in everybody's blood. Old man Spears stood up on the hay bale stage with his 2 sons and his fiddle glowing like a chestnut, and the caller was Ephraim Hollis himself in his thundering church voice. And the first sets formed up before the dust of the last wagon had settled. It went the way it always went. Sophie was on the floor from the first note, bright as a penny, with the Olsen boys steering her like a man entrusted with the church silver. Ingrid held her little court by the south door, promised her dances too deep, and was, it must be said honestly, the prettiest thing under those beams, and knew it with a queenly completeness that was almost innocence. Lars smoked in the stubble with the older Danes and Bohemians and argued rye prices. And Marta came in with the cake held before her, in her blue dress, with her mother's lace at the throat, and her hair braided and pinned in a crown the way her mother had worn it. And she carried the cake the length of the barn to the supper tables, and it is the plain sad truth that a stranger watching the room would have understood the whole standing of things in that township just from watching that one crossing. The way the crowd parted a little wider for her than it needed to, the way the eyes slid to her and then quickly sideways to trade with other eyes. The way a snicker ran along the young men by the door like wind along a wheat field, starting where Roy Callum stood in his store, bought coat, with a cup of cider, and his evening's audience already gathered. She set the cake down. She helped Mrs. Prucha and Delia Hollis lay the long tables. And then she went to the benches on the north wall and sat down among the wives and the grandmothers. A woman of 26 among the done dancing, with her hands folded in her lap, and settled herself to watch the evening the way she had watched 9 of them, from the shore. If she had been asked, on the ride over, what she hoped of the night, she would have said good music, no rain for the wagons, and that Sophie's first dance go kindly for her, and she would have meant every word. And there would have been, folded under the words where nobody was permitted to see it, one small hope the size of a lamp flame, the one she raised fresh every year and carried in with her and carried home again untouched, every year the hope any person carries into a room where there is music, and it does not need writing down, because you have carried it yourself. You know its name. Hold it in mind through what comes next, because the next part of this story is not easy to hear, and I will not pretend it is. The first hour was only the usual. Her father came and took her around the floor once, early in his wooden way, and stepped on nobody, which they both counted a triumph, and she laughed her low laugh, and he went back to his rye prices, well pleased with himself. A quadrille formed and dissolved and formed again. The Olsen boy brought Sophie by the benches to be approved, shining. And Marta straightened her sister's collar with 2 fingers and sent them back to the floor blessed. And the young men came north along the benches in their 2s and 3s, hats in hand, the whole convoy of them, working the row of waiting girls the way bees work a fence line of hollyhocks, and one by one the girls to Marta's left and right rose and were led away, and were returned, and rose again. And the bench planks creaked and shifted with the traffic all evening, and no one, not once, not ever, stopped in front of the big woman in the blue dress, and this was so usual, so worn into the grain of the evening, that not one soul in that barn thought of it as a thing that was happening. Except that, this year, from the far corner, leaning against a stall post with his hat in his hand and his eyes moving slow over the room like a man counting cattle, one soul did. It began, as it always began, with Roy Callum needing an audience, and it grew, as such things grow, because not one man in reach of his voice was willing to spend the small coin of courage it would have cost to say the word enough. The cider at a harvest dance was sweet, but there were jugs in the wagons that were not, and by 10 o'clock Roy and his half-dozen had made the trip to the stubble twice, and the second trip lit the meanness in him the way a match lights a lamp. The first sally was old stock. A set had just broken up, and the floor was loose and milling, and Roy walked out with 2 of his echoes to the middle of it, in the clear where the sound carried, and made a show of testing the planks with his boot heel, bouncing his weight, frowning down like a bridge inspector, and one of the echoes asked him loudly what he was about, and Roy said, in the voice he used for the porch at Pratt's, that he was only making sure the floor was sound, boys, because he had seen what was sitting on the north benches, and a man could not be too careful with a barn this age. It got its laugh. It always got its laugh. That was the tragedy of that town in one line, the reliable wages of that particular work. And the laugh ran up the barn on the young men's side and died where the married women sat, most of whom had the grace to study their mending. And Marta, 20 feet away, sat with her hands folded and watched the middle distance with the level gray calm of a woman who had been paying this toll since she was 10 years old and gave them nothing. Her neighbor on the bench, old Mrs. Prucha, laid one brown hand over Marta's folded 2 and left it there, and said nothing either, because what was there to say that the years had not worn out? The second Sally had a prop. Somewhere in the hour that followed, between sets, one of the echoes, the Slater boy, got hold of the schoolteacher's lettering chalk from the tally board by the door, where Miss Finch scored the cakewalk, and when the benches shifted for the Virginia reel, there was a rush of giggling at the north wall, and on the plank where Marta had been sitting, in a fair copy of A Fair Hand, was chalked the words reserved for the supper table, with an arrow pointing to the seat, and the knot of young men by the door was studying the rafters with their faces working, and the girls nearest, Ingrid's own circle, went red and looked away, and not one hand, not one, reached out to rub the words off the plank before Marta came back from helping Delia Hollis carry out the coffee boiler and found them. She stood a moment reading it. The barn had gone a little quiet, in patches, the way a barn does when everyone is pretending not to watch a thing. And Marta Jensen took her handkerchief from her sleeve, wiped the chalk from the plank in 2 strokes, folded the handkerchief again, sat down on the clean wood, and looked out at the floor with her chin exactly where it had been all evening. And the fiddle started, and the reel swept the room's attention away, and Mrs. Prooch's hand came back over hers, and that was the second Sally. I will tell you now what Marta herself said about that hour, many years on, to Sophie's eldest girl, who asked her Grandin straight out, the way children do, whether she had wanted to cry. She said no, not by then. She said crying is for when a thing surprises you, and none of it surprised her. She had eaten this bread before. She said what she felt was older and quieter than crying, that it was the feeling of standing in a long line at a door that never opens, with your papers in your hand year after year, knowing your papers are good, knowing the clerk knows it too, and the third thing she said the child did not understand until she was grown, and neither will everyone hearing this, but here it is as she said it. She said the worst of it was not being wanted less. The worst was being seen less. That the fat woman on the bench had somehow over the years stopped being a person the room could imagine wanting anything, wanting music, wanting a hand held out, wanting the ordinary bread of an evening, and when a room cannot imagine you wanting, it will do its cruelty in front of you the way men swear in front of a horse, easy, unashamed, certain that nothing present can be wounded. And then it was 9 o'clock, and the supper was laid, and the third thing happened, the one the county talked about after, because it had witnesses and a shape to it, and because of what followed it. The tables ran down the west side, 40 feet of plank and sawhorse under white cloths, and the township's whole pride was set out on them, and there was no argument in the room, there never was, about which pride stood tallest. Marta's glazed hams went first, always. Karen's cake sat at the center like a bride, and Ephraim Hollis, carving, called down the boards that the Jensen ham alone was worth the price of the barn. And Roy Callum, who had made his third trip to the wagons and come back with his collar loose and his audience trailing him like gulls behind a plow, took his plate down the table filling it, and stopped at the ham, and held up his loaded plate for inspection, and said, loud, in the pause while Hollis whetted the knife, "Well, boys, say what you like. The fat sister sets a fine table. She ought to. Look at the samples she takes." And then, warming. Because the laugh was coming up around him like dough rising, and a small man drunk on laughter will always chase it one sentence too far, he turned so the north benches could hear him plain. And he said it, the sentence this story hung from ever after, the one the town would spend years wishing out of its own mouth. He said, "You can put lace on her, boys, it changes nothing. Everybody here knows no one dances with the fat sister." There are sentences that change the temperature of a room. The barn did not go silent. A barn that size never goes silent, but it went cold at the middle, fast, the way a swimming hole goes cold at the spring, and the laugh that came was thin and had holes in it, because even that town, even 10 years deep in the habit of her, heard the difference between joking about a woman and walking a joke over to where she sat and breaking it across her face in front of 4 townships. Sophie, at the far tables, went white and started forward and was held, wisely, by the Olson boy. Lars Jensen was outside with the pipes and the rye prices, and by the great mercy of that night, never heard it said. Or this would be a different story. Ingrid stood 6 feet from Roy with her plate in her hand, and it is part of the honest record, and she owned it herself ever after with a straight back, that in that moment her eyes went first, before anything else, in a flash of pure inherited instinct to the men around her to see how the laugh was landing. Because standing near a joke has a cost, and she had a queendom to manage, and it took her 2 full seconds. 2, she counted them against herself for the rest of her life. To stop being the belle of Cedar Ford and start being Marta Jensen's sister, and by the time she had turned, with her face gone dangerous and the chokecherry sash snapping, someone else was already moving. Because here is what Roy Callum did not know. What nobody in that bright barn knew, except one silent man leaning on a stall post in the corner shadow with his hat in his hand. The biggest rancher in the county had been standing there for above an hour, unnoticed the way only a still man in a moving crowd can be unnoticed, watching the north benches. He had seen the boot heel performance. He had seen the chalk and seen her wipe it and seen her sit back down on the clean plank with her chin level, and he had stood there through all of it doing the thing he did, which was arithmetic. The long, slow, 11-year arithmetic of a county's worth of noise set against 14 hams in a dark smokehouse, and a burned kitchen turned into a dinner, and a plank of pies caught flat on 2 steady forearms, and at the words, "No one dances with the fat sister," the sum came out, and Gideon Rourke straightened off the post and put on his hat. And then, because he was a man who did nothing halfway, took it off again and started across the floor. The length of the Hollis barn was 110 feet, and the supper table stood at the west end, and the north benches ran the long wall, and so the walk Gideon Rourke took that night was, in plain measure, perhaps 90 feet. And every soul who stood in that barn told the story until they died as though it had taken an hour, and in the telling they were not wrong, because a room's time is not clock time. The crowd saw him come out of the corner the way you see a boulder move that you had taken for part of the hill, and the first 30 feet were nothing. A big man going for coffee, and then his line declared itself, angling up the north wall, and the nudging began, and the fiddle, which had been tuning for the after-supper sets, thinned away string by string as old man Spears, who missed nothing from his hay bales in 30 years, lowered his bow to watch, and by the time Gideon Rourke passed the middle lanterns, the barn had done the thing that barns cannot do and had gone quiet, truly quiet. Cough and creak quiet, 4 townships holding one breath. He passed Roy Callum close enough to brush his sleeve and did not look at him, and witnesses say Roy was still wearing the last inch of his grin, the way a man wears a hat the wind has already decided on. He passed the supper tables. And then he came up the line of the north benches, the whole gauntlet of wives and grandmothers and waiting girls, and here the story divides by who is telling it, because every girl on that bench lived the same 3 seconds separately. He passed the Slater girls. He passed the Olson cousins. And he came abreast of Ingrid Jensen, who had put her plate down, and Ingrid, by her own lifelong account, given always with the dry, unsparing honesty that was the best of her, felt the eyes of the county land on her like a crown being lowered, and rose. Because, of course. Because who else? Because in the arithmetic of that town there was no other sum. The biggest man was crossing for the prettiest girl. The evening had simply been building the stage for it, and she rose with the reflex of 20 years of being the answer to every such question. Her hand already lifting, her chin already tilting into the light, and Gideon Rourke walked past her. He did not do it unkindly. He touched his brow to her, courteous as a gate latch, the way you acknowledge a neighbor's daughter. And his boots did not so much as hitch, and Ingrid Jensen was left standing in the light, with her hand half raised, and the crown stopping in the air above her head, and moving on down the bench like a bird refusing a fence post, and she said, 60 years later, laughing. An old woman with her granddaughter's hair in her hands, that no schooling in her life ever taught her more in 2 seconds, and that God forgive her, her very first thought, before the shame, and before the wonder, was that there must be some mistake. And there was no mistake. Gideon Rourke stopped in front of Marta Jensen, the big woman in the blue dress with her mother's lace at her throat and the wiped trace of a chalked joke still faint on the plank beside her. And he stood with his hat in both hands, and the nearest lantern was directly above him, so that everyone on that wall could see his face plainly and see that it wore nothing but a kind of grave attention, as if what he was doing were the most ordinary act in Kansas and the barn were strange for holding its breath at it. And he said, in that voice that never rose and never needed to, "Ma'am, I believe the next is a waltz, and I would be honored." 6 words of asking, after 26 years. Mrs. Prucha's hand, resting on Marta's, closed hard, and Marta Jensen looked up at the tall, grave man with the hat in his 2 hands, and here's the detail that the county, which got so much wrong about her for so long, finally got right. Because 40 pairs of eyes were on her face at a range of 10 feet, and the truth for once had witnesses. She did not flush, and she did not tremble, and she did not look, as the mean-hearted whispered later she must have, like a starving woman shown bread. She looked at him the way she looked at weather coming over the West Ridge, steadily, taking its true measure. A woman who had been the punchline of one joke for 10 years, making certain, in 3 long seconds, that she was not about to be the punchline of a larger one. And Gideon Rourke stood still under that, reading the way an honest man stands still for a brand inspector, and let her look, and whatever she found in his face, it satisfied her ledger. And she said, "Thank you, sir, I believe it is," and put her hand in his, and rose. Old man Spears said afterward that he had lifted his bow before her hand was fairly up, because a fiddler's business is to catch a room's one perfect moment as it falls, and he gave the downbeat like a man tipping a full bucket. And his sons came in under him, and the waltz opened up warm and wide, and the biggest rancher in the county led the fat Jensen sister out onto 90 feet of empty floor with 4 townships standing back against the walls, and they danced. And Kansas learned something that night that Denmark had known all along, which is that a big woman who has worked every day of her life carries herself like a full ship, and the sea was smooth. She was light. It has been sworn to by too many witnesses to doubt, graceful, easy, sure. Her head up and her mother's lace catching the lantern gold, turning down that floor with the stillness at her center that all her work had always had, and Gideon Rourke, who had not danced in 6 years, kept up the way a man keeps up with good news. And somewhere in the second circuit of the floor, the barn remembered its manners, and other couples came out, Sophie hauling the Olson boy by the wrist, with tears standing in her eyes, and her chin up like a soldier, Hollis and Delia, the foreman Tom Reyes bowing to Mrs. Prucha, who was 70 and came off that bench like a girl, and the floor filled in around the tall man and the big woman until they were just 2 people dancing in a crowd of dancers, which was, if you understand it rightly, the entire gift, the thing she had been owed for 10 years, not to be spectacle, not to be lesson, just to be a woman at a dance. Dancing. They danced that waltz and the schottische after it, and then she said she was needed at the coffee, which was true, because with Marta a thing said was always true, and he walked her to the boiler and thanked her, plainly, before the wives, and went and stood by his corner post again, with his hat back on, and to the eye of a stranger nothing whatever had happened. A man had danced twice and taken up his post, but the barn was not strangers. The barn understood with one mind what it had watched. It had watched the county's habit be picked up by its scruff, carried 90 feet in front of everybody, and set down broken. And though not one word of rebuke had been spoken aloud, every man in that room who had ever laughed on the porch of Pratt's store had just been asked a silent question, and knew it. And the silence where Roy Callum's next joke should have been was so loud that men remembered it as sound. Roy left early. Somebody's harness needed seeing to, he announced, to nobody. The dance ran till 2, and the Jensen wagon rolled home under a sky of hard bright stars, Lars smoked out and content, having heard by then 9 versions of a thing he had missed entire. Sophie asleep on Marta's shoulder with her dancing shoes in her lap. Ingrid straight-backed and silent in the corner of the box, conducting, behind her eyes, the complete and painful reformation of a small queendom, and Marta sat with the reins loose in her hands, because she always drove, night or day, and watched the road come at her out of the dark, and said nothing at all. But Sophie, half waking on the long rise above the river, heard her sister singing under her breath, in Danish, the song their mother had sung to the hogs to gentle them, and Sophie kept her eyes shut and rode the rest of the way home inside that sound, and said later it was the first time she ever understood that her sister had been carrying something heavy for years and years, because she heard what the voice sounded like on the one night the weight was set down. You would like to think, and I would like to tell you, that the town woke up the next morning cured. It did not. A habit 10 years deep does not die of one waltz, and by Monday the porch at Pratt's had done what porches do with a thing too large to laugh at, which is to whittle it down until it fits. The whittling took the shape of a rumor, and the rumor, which had Roy Callum's fingerprints all over it though it walked around town wearing other men's mouths, was this, that it had been a bet. That some of the cattlemen had got up a purse, the way they did over horse races, and that Rourke had walked that floor for money, or for a joke of his own, a deeper joke, the joke of the century, and that the proof of it would be his absence. Watch and see, boys. A man does not haul his freight to that scale twice. The rumor ran through both saloons in an evening, the story went around the whole township inside a week, and it reached the Jensen quarter, as such things reach the people they are about, last and sideways through Sophie, who heard 2 women traded in the mercantile in half whispers, and came home with her fists balled and cried it out at the supper table in a fury too big for her body, and there was a silence, and Lars set down his fork, an event in itself, and it was Marta who spoke. She said the rumor had one virtue, which was that it could be checked. She said, if the man came again, it was false. If he did not, then the evening had been what it had been anyway, a good waltz, well danced, and she had had worse Saturdays, and would they pass the beans? And Lars looked at his eldest daughter down the length of the table with an expression the girls could not read, because it belonged to an older country and passed the beans. That was Tuesday. On Sunday, Gideon Rourke came up the Jensen Lane at 2 in the afternoon in a buggy, which is a thing to note in itself, because a man rides a horse on his own errands, but he drives a buggy when he means for someone to ride beside him. And he wore his black coat, and he had shaved close, and he asked Lars Jensen, on the porch in front of the household, for the favor of taking Miss Marta Jensen driving on the river road, and Lars, who had spent a week being told by the county what the man's dance had and had not meant, looked him over the way you look over a bull you are thinking of buying into your herd. All deliberation, no hurry. And said that Marta's time was her own to give, and Marta stood in the doorway with her apron still on, and the whole family and the 2 hired men, and possibly the dog held still, and she said that she had bread coming out at 4, and Gideon Rourke said then we had best drive out along the north cut and be back by 4, and that answer, neighbors, that answer was the whole man. He had not said the bread could wait. He had not laughed at the bread. He had folded the bread into the plan like a man who understood that the bread was not an obstacle to who she was. The bread was who she was. And Marta took off her apron and got her shawl and rode out beside him up the river road at a fat trot in front of God and the dinner-cooling windows of 3 farms, and was back by 4, and the bread came out right. And after that Sunday there was no rumor in Cedar Ford worth feeding, though the porch tried for a while yet, out of pure momentum. The courting of Marta Jensen and Gideon Rourke ran through that winter into spring, and it was a courtship the like of which the county had not seen, because it was conducted almost entirely in the language the 2 of them actually spoke, which was work. He came Sundays, and some Saturdays, and what they did was drive, and walk his ground and her father's, and talk shop, hogs, grass, weather, cures, prices, the long game of a farm year, and the county, peering at them across a decade of its own foolishness, could not for the life of it make out where the romance was, and the answer, which the county was not equipped to receive, was that it was everywhere. It was the whole fabric, because for the first time in her grown life, Marta Jensen was being asked what she thought by someone who then acted on the answer, and if you do not know why that is romance, this story cannot teach you, though it will keep trying. He brought her, on the third Sunday, not flowers, the county noted, actually scandalized, no flowers, but a problem, a real one. His winter losses on the north sections, cattle going into the cold heavy and coming out in March like fence rails, and she went at it with him over the kitchen table with the gray ledger open, feed sheds here, windbreaks there, sort the she-stock by age, and wind the feeding into the low ground after New Year. And some of what she proposed was Danish buyer keeping a Kansas cattleman would never have met, and he tried it that same winter on 2 sections as a test, and in March his test cattle came off the snow 80 pounds heavier than their neighbors, and he drove her out personally to look at the difference, and stood beside her at the fence, not saying anything, letting the cattle say it. And Marta looked at that fat, contented test herd for a long while, and then said, in Danish, quietly, a sentence her mother used to say over a well-risen batch of loaves. And when he asked what it meant, she said it meant the oven knew all along, and if that March fence line was not where the thing between them finished settling into place, then it was the buggy seat on the drive home. Where, in the middle of a comfortable silence about heifers, Gideon Rourke said, not turning his head, that he had been thinking that his house had 11 rooms and 1 man in it, and that this struck him as poor stocking of good range, and Marta, looking straight up the road, said that it was the worst she had heard of, and neither of them smiled, out of respect for the gravity of the negotiation. And by the time the buggy came down the Jensen lane they were engaged, though no word of asking had passed, because between 2 people who mean it, the asking can travel inside plainer freight. He did speak to Lars, formally, in the parlor, hat in hand, and Lars wept, which nobody had planned for, and shook his hand for a long time, saying nothing in 2 languages. And it needs telling, because it is the last stitch in this part of the story, what passed between Marta and Ingrid the night before the wedding. They had shared a room all their lives. The candle was out. And into the dark, Ingrid, 23 years old and holding it since October, finally said it, that on the night of the dance, when he came down the bench, she had stood up, that she had been so sure. That being so sure was the thing she could not get past her throat, because what did it say of her, and what did it say of what they had all, every one of them, been so sure of all those years, about who a man crosses a floor for? And there in the dark she asked her big sister to forgive her for having stood, and Marta was quiet a while. And then she said the thing that Ingrid carried the rest of her days and gave away freely to every vain young girl she ever raised or taught or loved, because Ingrid grew, in time, into the kind of old woman who tells the truth about her own youth on purpose. Marta said, "You stood up because the town taught you the sum, and you had the wit to be ashamed when the sum came out wrong, and shame with wit behind it is just learning with its collar turned up." Then she said, "Now go to sleep. I am getting married in the morning, and I intend to be terrible to live with tomorrow." And Ingrid laughed in the dark. And the 2 Jensen sisters went to sleep for the last time under one roof, friends, which is not how such stories usually run, and is exactly how this one did. They were married in April of 1883 in the Cedar Ford Church by Reverend Milburn, on a morning of high white clouds and a south wind full of plow smell, and if you want to take the temperature of a town, watch it at a wedding it never expected. The church was full. Curiosity filled some pews, and real gladness filled others. And the gladness sat mostly with the people who had eaten at Marta's tables and taken her bread when fever went through their houses, which, once you counted, was a much longer roll than the porch at Pratt's ever imagined. Delia Hollis stood up with her. Tom Riaz stood up with him, in a collar that was strangling him, proud as a governor. The bride wore her mother's lace and a dove-gray dress she had sewn herself, and the groom, they said, watched her come up the aisle the way a man watches rain come after a dry year, still with his hat over his heart, like something two needed to make noise about. And the county, whatever its sins, threw them a wedding dinner on the church grounds that ran 4 hours. Because a wedding dinner is a language every farm town speaks with its whole chest, and Marta Jensen, for the first time in her life, was made to sit and be served at a public table, and was terrible at it, and had to be shooed back into her chair twice, laughing, by a relay of matrons who had, some of them, snickered at her in October and were spending it off in gravy and shame. And that is how repentance mostly arrives in a small town, wearing an apron saying, "Sit down, Mrs. Rourke, we have got it." Mrs. Rourke, the name, went around the township like coin of a new mint, and the porch tried it a dozen ways in the following weeks, and some of the trying had a curl in it yet, and there was one more flare of the old sickness, and it should be told, because it shows where the poison had retreated to, and that it was not gone. Roy Callum, drinking at the bar of the North Saloon in May, was heard to say that Rourke had married himself a cook and a foreman and saved 2 wages, and to add a figure of arithmetic about the bride that I will not repeat, and the room did not laugh. Mark that, this time the room did not laugh, but neither did any man set down his glass and answer for her, and both of those facts are the truth of that town in that season, half healed and half hollow. And both facts were carried, as all facts were, out the door and up the roads. And this one reached the Rourke ranch by way of a hired man's wife. And Gideon heard it, and said nothing, being Gideon. And it was Marta, setting his coffee down the next morning, who spoke to the air between them the single sentence she ever spent on Roy Callum in her own house. She said, "The dogs bark, and the wagon goes on," which was her mother's proverb for it, and picked up her egg basket and went out, and Gideon watched her cross the yard, and made a private note in the ledger he kept, where nobody, not even she, ever read the entries, and the note had Roy Callum's name on it, and a patience to it, and we will come back to that page in its season, because Gideon Rourke's accounts always balanced eventually, every one. Now the year and a half that followed, the plain married season before the hard things came, is where this valley's luck was quietly forged, though nobody watching could have said so, and it deserves to be walked through slowly, because every piece of what saved that county was set in place in these months by an obese Danish farm wife whom half the district still thought of, when they bothered to think of her, as the punchline that had somehow married well. She came onto that ranch in April, and by May she had walked all 7,000 acres of it that a wagon or her own 2 feet could reach, with the gray ledger under her arm, and what she was doing was what she had done in the smoking dooryard at the Hollis place, reading the inventory, and what she read was this: a magnificent one-crop outfit, cattle and grass and nothing else, rich as a lord in October and naked as a fence post to any winter that came in hard, buying its flour, its pork, its lard, its garden truck, hauling everything 20 miles from a railroad that could stop any time the sky chose, and she said as much at the supper table, respectfully, to the man who had built it. And the man who had built it put down his fork and said, "Tell me." 2 words, and they were the 2 words that made everything after possible. Because a smaller man would have defended his kingdom, and Gideon Rourke opened the gate of his and let his wife drive straight in. That summer the ranch broke 60 acres of bottomland to corn and 40 to oats and potatoes and garden. Over the polite despair of cattlemen neighbors who held that plowing was a disease you caught from Kansas. That summer the hog pens went up, good Danish pens, dry and aired, and 20 sows came into them, and the county paper made a little fun. The cattle king turned swineherd, and the county paper, give it credit, printed a retraction of its fun 2 years later in a black-bordered box. And we will get to that too. And that summer, at the center of it all, went up the building this whole story has been walking toward, though nobody knew it then, least of all the 2 who built it. The smokehouse. not her mother's little sod burrow in a creek bank, and not the plank privy-sized affairs that stood behind every farm in the district, but a smokehouse conceived the way her grandfather's guild had conceived them in Jutland, laid up in native stone by the same hands that had laid the ranch house, 16 feet by 20 and high-ceilinged, with double fireboxes set outside the wall so the smoke came in cool and slow through a stone throat. Racks and beams for 300 hams. A brining room off the north side with a floor of laid brick and 6 oak tons her father freighted from the county seat as a wedding gift, and a stone salt cellar sunk below frost where a ton of coarse salt could sleep dry through any weather Kansas owned. The neighbors who came to see it did not laugh exactly, but they wondered at it loudly. A meat house built like a bank for one household, and Marta, showing them through, would only say that meat spoils fast and stone is patient, and that where she came from, you built the winter first and the summer after. And they went home and told their wives that Rourke's big wife had built herself a stone church for hams, and the phrase went the rounds and became the building's name, and she took no offense at it, because, as she said to Sophie, they were not wrong, it was the one sermon she knew by heart. By the fall of 1884 that stone room was hung dark and sweet with the proof of it, and her hams took the premium at the county fair again, under her own name now. M. Rourke and her lard went to the store in 50-pound cans and sold before it cooled, and the ranch that had bought its bacon for a decade sold bacon. And somewhere in those months, on an evening nobody recorded because happiness keeps poor minutes, Gideon Rourke sat by his own fire with his boots off and told his wife, plainly and once, the whole of the thing he had never told a living soul. His father's charm and his mother's hands. The hill farm that ran on her strength while he was witty in town. The grave at 14, and the gate that had shut in him at that graveside. And why, therefore, he had stood so long against the wall of every gathering in that county, watching for something he had quit believing, walked the earth, and what it had done inside him to stand in a barn full of laughter and watch a mocked woman wipe chalk off a plank and sit back down with her chin level, and Marta listened the whole way through without once touching him, because she knew better than to jostle a man mid-crossing, and when he was done she said only, "Then your mother sent you." And Gideon Rourke, who had not wept since that hillside, did not exactly weep then either, but he put his face in his wife's shoulder, and the fire had the room to itself for a while, and no more ever needed saying on the subject as long as they both lived. That is who was standing in the way, neighbors, when the bad years came over the ridge. That house. Those two. Remember them as they were that night, because every good thing in what follows walks out of that room. 2 pictures from that settled season deserve their frames before the sky turns, because the county kept them, and because each one planted something that the hard years would harvest. The first is the county fair of 1884, at the county seat, the last week of September. The big fair, the one with the racetrack and the brass band and the judging sheds that smelled of straw and cinnamon and ambition, and it matters, because it was the first time Marta Rourke ever stood in a judging shed beside her own work with her own name on the card. 20 miles is a long way behind a team, and in all her Jensen years she had sent her entries up with neighbors and stayed home with the stock, which is how 3 county premiums had come to hang in the Jensen kitchen under another initial. But a married woman with a husband who owned more horses than the fair had stalls travels differently. And Gideon, who had entered bulls every September for a decade, that year entered bulls and drove his wife. She brought the cardamom cake, a crock of the snow-white lard, 3 hams from the stone church's first hanging, and a dozen of the rye loaves, and what happened in the sheds that afternoon passed into the family's telling, because Sophie was there to see it and never let it go. The judge that year was not local. He was a wholesale provision man from Kansas City, brought in by the fair board for the annual reason that a local judge makes 7 friends and 40 enemies, and he came down the meat table with his thumb and his little knife and his citified boredom until he reached the Rourke hams, and the family record is precise about the sequence. He cut. He smelled the knife, He looked up to check the number against his sheet. He cut again lower, where a lazy cure always tells on itself. And then he stood there a moment with the shed noise going on around him. And then he asked generally of the air, in the voice of a man who has found a $20 gold piece in his change, who is M. Rourke. And the shed, which was half Cedar Ford people, all turned as one body, entirely without irony, proud as a family, and pointed at the big woman in the blue dress standing at the end of the table, and the provision man walked down and talked with her for a quarter of an hour, cure times and smoke woods and salt weights, the shop talk of his own trade, which he had plainly not expected to speak that day, and before he left the shed he offered, in front of witnesses, to take every ham that Stone Smokehouse could furnish, at Kansas City prices, standing offer, rail freight his, and Marta thanked him and said she would think on it. And on the ride home, when Gideon asked what there was to think on, she watched the stubble fields go by for a mile or so, and then said that a smokehouse that sells its whole hanging to Kansas City is a business, and a smokehouse with a full hanging and no obligations is a bank, and she had not yet decided what that stone room was going to need to be, and Gideon Rourke, who bantered with exactly one human being on this earth, said gravely that he had married a woman who hoarded pork against a rainy day, and his wife said, level as the road, no, against a white one, and neither of them knew that bright September afternoon how the county would come to prize that little joke, but the county does. It is in the histories, sworn to by Sophie under her married name, the fat wife of the Rourke Ranch. 1 full year before the fire, resting her hand on a premium ham and telling her husband, in 6 words, the entire plot of the winter that was coming for them all. The blue ribbon from that shed was the first premium ever hung in the stone house, and she hung it, characteristically, not in the parlor, but on a nail inside the smokehouse door where nobody would see it but the help and the hams. And when Delia Hollis asked her why there of all places, she said that praise belongs where the work can hear it. The second picture is smaller and warmer, and the county polished it even brighter. It is Christmas of 1884, the first Christmas of the marriage, and it is the day the Rourke Ranch invented, without meaning to, the custom that later saved it a measure of its soul. The open house. Marta had grown up keeping a Danish Christmas in a poor house, which is to say a Christmas made almost entirely of food, candles, and singing. The cheap materials, the ones that scale, and now she found herself with 11 rooms, 1 husband, 2 hired girls, a crew of unmarried riders with nowhere to be on the day, and a stone room full of the best pork in Kansas. And she did the arithmetic of that the way she did all her arithmetic, instantly and in favor of the table. Word went down the river road in the 2nd week of December, plain as a feed bill. The Rourke house would keep open doors on Christmas Day, from noon to dark, all welcome, bring nothing, and the county, which had 2 full generations of opinions about that house and its mistress, came, some out of love, some out of curiosity, some frankly out of appetite. Better than 140 souls through those doors before the early dark, and what they found was not the gentry Christmas some had come braced to resent, no receiving line, no display, but the old country kind, the whole long table filled and refilled, the smell of roast pork and cardamom clear out to the road, candles in every window, the hired men singing carols in 2 languages by the big fire with the schoolteacher at the parlor organ, and the big bright-faced woman of the house moving through all of it with a coffee pot, in her apron on Christmas Day, in her own mansion, as her guests would have it, and she heard that word mansion once too often in the course of the afternoon and was heard to answer it to old Mrs. Prucha, in the pantry, in a voice not meant to carry that carried anyway, that a house is only a mansion until you get enough neighbors chewing in it, after which it goes back to being a kitchen with rooms attached, and that she had waited her whole life to cook in this one, and the woman who reported the remark, and it was reported, wet-eyed, all along the river road that week, added the detail that finished it, that on the sideboard by the door, unexplained, unlabeled, there had stood a row of packed baskets, ham and bread and lard and a twist of coffee, and that certain wagons, the thin horse wagons, the patched harness wagons, had each been walked out to by a hired girl with a basket, quietly, while the singing covered it. So that no one went home short and no one went home shamed, and if you want to know where the great winter's whole method came from, the lists, the sledges, the giving that arrived looking like logistics, it came from that sideboard, fully formed, 2 years early, on a Christmas nobody was hungry yet. That was the house the fire found. That was the woman the winter found. The county had 3 premiums, a standing offer from Kansas City, a Christmas legend, and 10 years of porch jokes, all filed under the same name, and it still, on the whole, had not decided what it thought of her, because towns are slow readers of their own best pages. The sky decided for them. The summer of 1885 came in stingy and stayed mean. The June rain that Valley lived by simply did not arrive, and July went past like a peddler with empty pockets, and by August the Solomon was a chain of green pools with gravel bars showing between them. The corn fired in the leaf and made half a crop. The wheat came thin and light as a whisper, and the grass, the deep blue stem that was the whole bank account of that country, went from green to the color of a lion's back 2 months before its time, and stood there, cured to standing hay, dry as paper, mile on mile on mile of it, and every man and woman raised on the plains looked at all that dry standing grass, and looked at the brass sky, and carried in their stomachs down under the daily worry, a much older worry with a much older name, and did not say the name out loud, for the same reason sailors do not whistle on ships. Martha wrote 3 words in the gray ledger on the last day of August, in Danish, and the words were, "The year bites," and what the year had not done with drought, it commenced to do with wind. It came on the 9th of October, in the afternoon, on a day of low racing cloud and a south wind that had been building since morning until it moaned in the fence wire and leaned on the house like a tired steer. The Rourke Ranch smelled it before it saw it. Every human and every animal on the place lifting their heads inside the same minute, that oldest smell on the plains, grass smoke on a hard wind. And then the whole southern rim of the world had a brown smudge along it, like a dirty thumbprint dragged across the horizon, and Gideon stood on his corral rail and watched it widen for the space of 10 heartbeats, and began calling names, and there was no need to explain the work, because everyone born in that country had done the drill in their dreams for years. Prairie fire, running before a south gale on 2 months of cured grass, and 20 miles of it to feed on between the smoke line and the river. What happened in the next 18 hours has 100 tellings in that county, and this telling can hold only its share, and its share is this. The fire came up out of the Saline country in a front 11 miles across, moving, men swore afterward, faster than a horse could lope, throwing burning tumbleweeds a quarter mile ahead of itself over any plowed line it met, and the valley fought it the way settlements had always fought it, with plow and backfire and wet sacking and the wagon-hauled water barrel, at first each farm for its own buildings, then, as riders stitched the district together through the smoke, in gangs at the natural lines. The river road, the railroad grade, the old buffalo trace on the county line. Gideon Rourke fought it mounted for 18 hours at the head of every hand he had, turning cattle out of the path, dropping fence, setting backfires along the north cut with Tom Reyes under a sky gone the color of a bad bruise. And this story, which is not his story, will say of him only that men who were on that line followed him the rest of his life the way soldiers follow a man they saw once, at the worst hour, and leave it there. But the account this story is bound to keep is Marta's, because while the men fought the fire's front, somebody had to fight its future, and she saw the whole shape of that future in the first hour, standing in her ranch yard watching the smudge widen, doing the thing she did in every catastrophe of her life, standing still for 10 breaths. Reading the inventory. She saw that the buildings might be saved, and the people would likely be saved, and that what could not be saved, what was already lost the moment the smell arrived, was the grass. The winter grass and the hay standing in the meadows and stacked at the farmsteads south of the river, the whole cellar of that country's year. And that meant the actual war would not be fought that night against flame, it would be fought all winter against arithmetic, and nobody else in the district, in that hour, with the sky on fire, was thinking past morning. So Marta Rourke fought her fire in the kitchen and the yard, and her line held, too. She fed and watered every crew that passed, all night, gallons of coffee, cold ham by the washtub full, her own bread going out the door under the arms of boys black as stokers. She emptied the stone church of its spring hams to do it, and entered every side and shoulder in the ledger as it went, not from stinginess, from governance, because she already knew, hours before any man on the fire line let himself know it, that come January the district would need to learn exactly what food existed inside its borders, down to the crock, and somebody would need to have started the count while the smoke was still standing in the sky. By gray, exhausted morning the wind had backed into the northwest and died, and a thin, spiteful, quarter-inch rain, the only rain of that whole autumn, fell on the wreck and put the last of it out, and the county stood up out of its ashes and counted itself. The people had lived. Not untouched, there were burned hands and seared lungs, and one old man's heart had quit at his own plow handles on the backfire line, and the district buried him with honor, but the valley's families walked out of that night alive, and for a week that felt like victory. Then the other ledger opened. 4 farmsteads gone entire south of the river, and 11 barns. The Hollis Mill, the great red barn of the harvest dance, ash to the stone. The stacked hay of the whole South Range, gone. The corn that the drought had left, most of it standing dry in the field awaiting picking, gone. The grass itself, root safe, but sheared to black stubble, meaning nothing on 4 legs would take a mouthful off that ground before May. And the tally that mattered most and was said quietest, the winter feed of a cattle county, gone, within a month of winter, with the grass banks of every neighboring district burned or already grazed, and the price of shipped hay going up past reason even before the telegraph finished carrying the news. Horace Callum's land office did sums of its own that week, and they say the lamp burned late, and what it arrived at was that half the paper in the drawer would be worthless by spring, because you cannot mortgage ash. The county seat papers wrote that the district would recover in a season or 2, as counties do. The men at what was left of the crossroads talked railroad hay and government seed and the sale of stock. And the arithmetic they all circled and could not land on, because it was too big and too cold, was this, that between the burned feed and the burned barns, and a cattle market glutted overnight by every scorched county in Kansas selling at once, the beasts could neither be wintered nor sold. Not all of them, not near. And that valley was going into the cold season with its money on the hoof, its hoofs with nothing to eat, and its cellars, which had counted on the dead corn crop and the burned gardens of a drought year, thinner than any autumn in its history. It was Marta, at the first meeting of the district after the fire, held perforce in the Cedar Ford Church, the Grange Hall being cinders, who stood up in the women's pews and said the cold thing out loud. She said the district was counting its cattle and ought to be counting its dinners. She said drought years breed hard winters. Her grandfather had seen it, and her ledger now said it too, and that if the winter came in early and shut the railroad, and it could, this valley would be 60 days from want by Candlemas. And she proposed the district begin now, in October, a common accounting of its food, farm by farm, and a plan for its stock, and she used a plain word, slaughter. And the church went stiff at it. And a voice from the men's side, and it was not even Roy's this time, said something half under its breath about the Rourke house never being in danger of missing a meal anyhow, and got its little ration of laughter, thin but alive, that laugh, still alive even in the ashes, and Marta Rourke stood in the pew with the gray ledger against her chest and looked at them and sat down, and the meeting moved on to railroad hay, and the minutes of that meeting, which survive, record no action taken. Riding home, Gideon, whose jaw had been set at an angle she knew since the church door, said finally that they were fools and would starve as fools, and Marta watched the black country go by the buggy for a while and then said no. They were not fools. They were people who had spent 10 years learning not to hear her. and that a town cannot unlearn a habit at a meeting. It unlearns it the way it learned it, one hard proof at a time, and then she said the sentence he quoted at her graveside 40 years later. She said, "So we will set the proof where they will walk into it." And she opened the ledger on her knees in the smoke-smelling dark and began to write the winter before the winter came. What Marta Rourke did in the 6 weeks between the fire and the freeze, she did with her husband's whole backing and the district's whole amusement, and it looked to the amused like one more chapter of the fat wife's Danish strangeness, and it was in cold fact the building of the ark. First, salt within 4 days of the fire, before the ash had stopped blowing. A Rourke wagon was on the road south to the salt works on the Smoky Hill with Tom Riaz on the box and an order in Marta's square hand, and it came back 9 days later hauling 3 tons of coarse rock salt and a keg of saltpeter. And it turned around and went again, and went a third time until the stone cellar under the smokehouse held better than 8 tons. More curing salt than the whole district had bought in 5 years together, and Aldous Pratt, who heard the tonnage from the freighter, told the porch, and the porch had its best week since the wedding. 8 tons. The woman had bought salt like a county buys gravel. They said Rourke's wife must mean to pickle the ranch itself, fence posts and all. They said a lot of things, October things, fat and easy things said in the last warm light of a world that still believed the railroad would always run, and every one of those sayings would come back around before spring wearing a different face, the way sayings do. Second, the herd. On the last Sunday of October, Gideon Rourke did the thing that made him briefly the most talked of fool in 3 counties, a title he accepted without comment. Against a market glutted to the floorboards, against the advice of every cattleman at the crossroads, he cut his herd to the bone, sold half at ruinous autumn prices for what cash the buyers still had. And then, with the range black and hay unbuyable, he turned the remaining math over to his wife entire, and his wife's math was this, that a beast you cannot feed is not stock. It is meat spoiling on 4 legs. And the only question left to a sane household was whether the spoiling would happen in a February snowdrift feeding crows or in November feeding people. They kept the she-stock and the best bulls close-herded on the unburned north sections, wintered on the oats and corn fodder of their own plowed acres. The plowing the county had laughed at, feeding out of the sheds the county had also laughed at, and everything else, better than 400 head, went under the knife at the ranch in the great November slaughter that the district would remember. Afterward, the way it remembered the fire itself, as one of the 2 events that made the winter survivable, and at the time it looked to the watching county like madness of a new and richer kind. For 11 days the Rourke yard ran like a Jutland November out of her grandfather's time, scaffolds and kettles and cutting tables in ordered lines, every hand on the payroll and a dozen hired neighbors besides, working under the direction, and there was no ambiguity about this in any account anyone ever gave. Every man there said it the same way, under the direction of the boss's wife, a very large woman in a man's canvas coat with her sleeves rolled, moving down the tables slow and certain as a river barge. Teaching hands twice her strength the cuts her grandfather's guild had taught, salting down beef by the ton in the brining room, hams and rounds going into cure by the hundredweight, tallow rendered by the barrel, sausage and casings by the furlong, smoke standing off the stone church's fireboxes day and night for 2 weeks, until the whole river bend smelled like Christmas. And the beef that could not be cured in time, salted hard in barrels, the cooper in Cedar Ford turned out in a rush order that paid his whole winter. When it was done, the Rourke Ranch held cured and salted meat in a quantity no household in the history of that county had ever held, and the district, hearing the figures third hand, laughed its last comfortable laugh of the decade. What in the name of heaven did 2 people want with a stone house full of 40,000 pounds of meat? It was November. By March, every man who had asked the question could answer it, and most of them answered it standing in that yard with their hats in their hands. Because the winter came, and it came the way she had told them in the church it might, early and in earnest, and then in fury. The first blizzard rolled down out of Dakota in the last days of November, 3 days of it, and the drifts it left in the railroad cuts were packed by wind to the hardness of chalk rock, and the plows and shovel gangs had scarcely opened the line before the second storm shut it again, harder. And that was the rhythm of that whole terrible winter. Storm, dig, storm. The railroad opened 2 days in 10, then 1 in 10, then, after the great January blizzard that old people on the plains measured all other weather against for the rest of their lives, not at all, 3 full weeks of nothing moving on the line in either direction. And the Valley of the Solomon, which had sent its money to market on the hoof in October and burned its cellar in the fire, was cut off from the world with the thermometer going to 20 below and staying there like it had been hired. What that winter did to the cattle counties of the plains is written in the histories, and this valley's chapter was written in the first week of January, when the storm they afterward called the Great One came down on the last free-ranging herds of the district, the herds of the men who had scoffed at selling and scoffed at plowing and bet on an open winter with the grass burned to the roots, and had drifted those cattle before it into the fence corners and the cut banks and the frozen river bends, and there it left them. There is no need to dwell on it, and out of respect for the men who wept over their own dead stock that January, we will not. Say only that the district's cattle wealth, all that the fire and the autumn sales had spared, died on the drifts in a week, and that when the wind quit and the sun came out onto that glittering, silent ruin, the families of that valley walked their fence lines and understood, each in its own kitchen, in its own hour, with its own particular quiet. The thing Martha Rourke had said out loud in the church in October. They counted their dinners. The flour barrels were low, because the mill had burned, and milling ran 20 miles by wagon when the roads were open, and the roads were not open. The gardens had made nothing in the drought. The hogs, most places, had been sold or eaten small because the corn to fatten them had burned standing. The hens were in the stew pot by New Year. And the horror standing out in every drifted pasture, the hundreds of tons of dead, frozen beef scattered across a starving district, was, and every farm wife knew it, even as her husband tried not to, mostly beyond saving, because a beast dead of storm and buried in drift for days is a gamble no careful woman feeds her children on, and even where a man got to his dead stock fast and clean, what could he do with 2,000 pounds of meat and no salt in the county? No salt. Market. The store's curing salt had sold out to panic inside a week in December. And the railroad that would bring more was a white trench from horizon to horizon. Fresh meat in a thaw goes off in days. A family can eat perhaps a quarter of a beef before the weather turns on them, and the wolves and the ravens take the rest, and that is the cold arithmetic that sat down to supper with every family in that valley in the middle of January, in the coldest winter in living memory, 60 days at least from any relief, exactly as the fat woman with the ledger had told them in October, standing in the women's pews, being laughed at. On the 20th of January, the district called a meeting at the church, and this time nobody scheduled it around the railroad hay that was not coming, and this time the women came too. All of them. Which in that place and time was itself the ringing of a bell, and the room was not a town meeting. It was 200 frightened people in wet wool in a cold church with the windows going blue at 4 in the afternoon. And Ephraim Hollis, who had lost his mill and his barn and stood up anyway because somebody decent had to, called the question in 3 sentences. And the third one was, "We are going to be hungry by March, and I for one am done pretending different," and into the silence after it, from the men's side, came the sound this whole long story has been waiting to hear. It was Horace Callum, the land agent, the father of the joke, a man watching his paper kingdom die on the drifts with everybody else's cattle, and he stood up slow. An old gray fox with the shine gone off him, and he did not orate. For once in his life he asked, plainly, like a man asking directions in the dark, "Does anybody in this district know how to save that meat?" And 200 heads, one after another, in a slow wave down that cold church, turned and looked at the north pews, where Martha Rourke sat with the gray ledger on her knees. And Marta looked back at them, all of them. The porch and the benches and the saloons and the supper table of 10 years, every face that had laughed and every face that had only stood by and let the laughing happen, and if she had been a smaller soul, this would be the place in the story where the debt came due, and she would have made them wait for it. One long, delicious minute, and no jury in Kansas would have convicted her. She stood up before the wave of faces had even finished turning. She said, yes, she said, I do, and I will need every pair of hands in this valley starting at daylight tomorrow, and she opened the ledger to a page she had written in October, in the smoke-smelling dark of a buggy before the first snow had flown, and began. In her calm receipt book voice, in the blue cold of that church, to read that county its instructions. What she read out in the church that afternoon, and what the district then did, beginning at daylight the next morning and not stopping in any real sense until March, has gone into the county histories under the name the women gave it that same week, the Great Saving. And it is worth setting down in order, because it shows what she had been building in that gray ledger all those weeks while the porch laughed about pickled fence posts, and because there are people alive today because of the order it happened in. First came the triage, because the drifted cattle were a bank whose notes were expiring by the hour, and not all of them could be honored, and knowing the difference was the whole game. She was the only soul in that district with the knowledge to draw that line, and she drew it hard and plain and made every writer memorize it before they memorized anything else. A beast found frozen fast and unbroken, frozen quick in the storm's first night, and kept hard frozen since, that beast was money in the bank, but a beast that had lain sheltered and thawed and stiffened again. A beast the ravens had opened, a beast down in water. That beast was left where it lay. No matter whose brand it wore, and no matter how its owner argued, and men did argue. Hungry men with dead fortunes in the snow, and they found arguing with Marta Rourke to be like arguing with the multiplication table. And the line held, and because the line held, no family in that valley was ever poisoned by what the winter fed them, which is its own quiet monument, and the doctors in the county seat said so afterward in writing. Then came the gathering. Every sound sledge and sled in the district was pooled under Tom Reyes and Old Hollis, and crews with axes and crowbars went out along the fence lines and the cut banks in the terrible cold, working the drifts where the herds had died, and the frozen beeves came out of the snow hole and hard as statuary, and went onto the sledges and down the packed river road in black processions against thee. White, day after day, to the Rourke Ranch, because the Rourke Ranch was where the salt was, and the stone church, and the tables, and the kettles, and the one mind in the county that held the whole method entire. And there, in that yard, for 6 weeks, was fought the actual battle of that winter. And the county won it. And the county won it because a woman it had spent 10 years laughing at stood in the middle of it the whole way through, and showed them how. She ran that yard the way she had run the burning Hollis kitchen, in lists, calmly, 100 people at a time. And she ran it in a canvas coat over 3 skirts with a scarf over her ears and the ledger in a flour sack against the wet. And the picture of her that winter that the valley kept, the one the old people described to their grandchildren, was of a very large woman standing at the head of a line of scrubbed plank tables in the smoking cold, tirelessly still at the center of enormous motion, saying, in a voice that never once rose all winter, next, and thaw that one slower, and more salt to table 4. The frozen beef had to be thawed to working temper in the sheds, not too fast, and never twice. Then the cutting, and she had 4 crews at that within the week, because she taught as she worked, taking the greenest hands herself. The county's men knew cattle from the outside and their own autumn hog from long habit. But nobody else knew the deep craft of it. How to break down beef by the hundredweight so that nothing was lost and every cut went to its right fate. This to the brine tons, this to the hard salt barrels, this to the smoke, this to the mincing tables for sausage. this rendered. This to the boiling kettles for the potted meat the little children of that winter grew up on and asked their mothers for into the next century. Her hands taught 40 pairs of hands that craft in 6 weeks, and those 40 taught their neighbors, and that knowledge stayed in that valley 2 generations and fed it through 2 more hard winters before the world changed enough to forget it. And the salt, the famous 8 tons of Madwoman salt that the porch had dined on all October, the salt was the axle the whole thing turned on, measured out crock by crock and barrel by barrel in her square hand. Every pound entered against every family's account in the ledger, not as debt. She never once in that winter took a cent or a pound of meat for the use of her salt or her Stonehouse ore. Her craft, but as governance, so the district would know at any hour what it had and how long it would last, and it was the ledger arithmetic, posted plain on the smokehouse door every Saturday for any man to read, that kept 200 frightened people from the hoarding and the snatching that broke other districts that same winter, because fear cannot count. And she could, and she showed them the count, and the count said, weekly, in figures a child could follow, we will make it to April, and the district chose, every week, to believe its fat bookkeeper, and the district was right. Now on the 4th day of the great saving, a thing happened in that yard that the county talked about as long as it talked about anything, and it must be told carefully, because it is easy to tell it as triumph, and it was not triumph, it was better. A little before noon, a saddle horse came up the river road ridden badly by a young man with no proper winter gear on, and it was Roy Callum, and the yard went quiet by degrees as he was recognized, table by table, the way frost comes over a window. The Callum sections had died on the drifts with everyone else's. The land office paper was so much kindling. Horace had taken to his bed the week of the meeting, and the son, the whittler of 10 years of little cruelties, the author of the sentence, had ridden 6 miles in the cold to the yard of the woman he had made his living joke. And every soul at those tables knew every count of the indictment, and every soul stopped working to watch him walk from the gate to the cutting lines. The longest 90 feet in Kansas since a certain barn floor, and he came up in front of her, and he could not speak. They said his mouth worked, and nothing came. And Marta Rourke looked at him for a moment. Only a moment, with the ledger open on her arm, and what was in her face nobody ever claimed to have read. And then she said, in exactly the voice she used on every other pair of idle hands that winter, "You are late. There are aprons on the rail. Table 6 wants a strong back," and turned back to her work. That was all. That was every word of the reckoning between them that winter. You are late. Table 6. And Roy Callum put on an apron with his hands shaking, half from cold, and went to Table 6, and worked there until dark, and came back at daylight, and the valley, watching, understood 2 things by sundown of that first day. It understood that she would not spend 1 breath of that winter on revenge. There was no time. Revenge kept nobody's children fed. And it understood, watching him fumble a knife under her patient correction, again, slower, mind your thumb, that something bigger than embarrassment was being performed at Table 6, that the whole architecture of the town's old cruelty was being taken apart in public, hour by hour, not by shaming its author, but by putting him to school under its target. And no sermon Reverend Milburn ever preached did the work in that valley that the sight of Roy Callum, day after frozen day, learning to be useful from Marta Rourke's own hands, did without 1 word being said about it by anybody. He worked that yard all 6 weeks. He came to be, they said, not bad at it. And the change that winter wrought in him held for life, which is a rarer sentence in a true story than in a made-up one, and this is a true story. Or as true as a story gets after passing through 60 years of firelight, and how it held, and what he said in front of 4 townships when the lanterns were lit again, belongs a little further on. While the yard fought the beef, the kitchen fought the rest of the winter, and the kitchen's war was longer. Meat, even meat by the ton, is not a diet, and Marta had known since October what the burned mill and the failed gardens meant, and had laid in against it with the same unfashionable foresight that had bought the salt. The oats and corn of the ranch's own plowed acres, the acres the cattlemen had pitied, came out of the cribs all winter and went under the hand quern and the borrowed coffee mills of a dozen households. For there was no water milling with the wheel 20 miles off and the roads shut, and the coarse, sweet meal that came off those little mills went into the bread that Marta and a changing crew of valley women baked in the brick ovens of the ranch. The big oven Gideon had built her as a wedding present, and the summer oven in the yard besides, both fired every day but Sunday, from January to April. And it was Sophie, 19 that winter, and grown suddenly and permanently older, who kept the count that got into the histories. 412 bakings, better than 5,000 loaves out of one kitchen in one winter, and not one loaf sold. And when a state historical man came out years later and asked the old women of that district what they remembered of the great winter. Before the blizzards, before the dead herds, before any of it, every one of them said the same first thing: the smell of bread on the river road. Twice a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays, the provision sledges went out from the Rourke place with an escort of whoever could ride. Meat, meal, lard, potted beef, sausage, down the river road and up the school section road and along the north cut, farm by farm, checked against the ledger so much by the count of heads in the house, the count kept by Miss Eudora Finch, the school teacher, who knew every family's children to the child, and this was Marta's doing too, and maybe the shrewdest of all of it, that the giving went by list and not by asking, that a proud man never had to come begging to anybody's gate, the sledge simply came to his, as it came to every gate, the bankers and the widows alike, and what would have been charity, which chokes a certain kind of throat, was made to look like logistics, which any man can swallow, and if you think that distinction small, you have never been poor in a proud house in a cold county. Even so, some throats were narrower than others. The Slater place, up the north cut, the family of the boy who had chalked the bench 3 winters gone, sent its sledge back untouched the first week of February. The man of the house, standing bare, headed in the cold to refuse it, saying loudly enough for the escort to hear that the Slaters had never taken from that particular hand and would not start, and the escort carried the message back, braced for what the old town would have expected, the shrug, the note in the ledger, the family left to its pride. What they watched instead became one of the fixed stars of the story. Marta Rourke went up the north cut herself the next morning, alone, driving the light sledge through a mean gray wind, and she was in the Slater house 1 hour. And no one, then or ever, learned the whole of what was said in it, because she never told, and the Slaters never told. But when she came out, Slater himself carried her provisions in from the sledge with his hat off, and his wife stood in the door with her apron to her eyes, and the following Tuesday the man was at the ranch yard at daylight asking for a table, and worked out the winter there. And his boy, the chalk boy, grown now, worked beside him, and all the district ever got of that hour was what Mrs. Slater said once, years on, to Mrs. Prucha, that the big woman had sat down at their bare table like a neighbor and talked, not of provisions at all, but of her own worst winter, the one after her mother died, when she was 19 and proud and drowning and took no help either, and of exactly what that pride had cost her before she learned its price, and that she had then stood up and said, "I will not leave a house where children sleep hungry over a quarrel between grown folks, so you may keep the quarrel, Mr. Slater, I want only the hunger." And there was no more to be done against her after that sentence. A body might as well quarrel with the stove for heating the room. February was the mountain. The cold never broke that month. Wood ran short in a country whose timber was river bottom and hedgerow, and the district learned to bank its fires with twisted hay and corn cobs, and to sleep 3 families to a farmhouse and shut the cold rooms off, and through those weeks the stone smokehouse and the kitchen behind it were the beating heart of the valley in the plainest sense there is. The one place where there was always warmth, always work, always food, and always that voice that never rose, saying next, and mind your thumb, and take another loaf when you go. They came to her door all that month, all winter, in every weather, at every hour, the whole county in its turns, some for provisions, and some for salt, and some for her opinion of a doubtful barrel, and some, more than you might credit, for nothing they could name, for the warmth of the one room in Kansas where the winter felt organized, and the door was never once shut on any of them. And among the ones who came was, on a night of hard wind in the middle of the month, Horace Callum, up out of his sickbed against his doctor's word, driven the 6 miles by his son, and what the old land agent wanted. It turned out was not provisions. He stood in her kitchen with his hat held in both hands, an old gray man gone thin, and he took a folded paper out of his coat, and it was the mortgage on Lars Jensen's quarter. The paper he had held over her father through every thin year since 1879, marked satisfied in full across its face. And he put it on her table by the bread bowl and said that he had spent that winter, learning what his notes were worth when the snow came for them. All of them, every farm on his books, worthless, except as this house had made them worth something again by keeping the farmers on them alive, and that he reckoned the district's accounts with her would never balance anyhow, but a man had to start somewhere, and he was starting where his own son had taught him there was a debt. And Marta Rourke looked at the mortgage on her table, her father's 20 years of weather, paid off in a stranger's ink. And she thanked him, level as always. And then she cut the bread that was standing on the board and made the old man sit and eat buttered warm bread at her table before she let him back out into the cold. Because that was the whole grammar of her. She received an amends the way she received a catastrophe, by feeding whoever was standing in front of her when it arrived. And the last thing to say of that winter before the sun comes back into this story is the thing the valley itself did not fully see until it was over, because you cannot see the shape of a thing from inside it. 60 other districts on those plains went through that same winter, the same fire-scoured autumn, the same shut railroads, the same dead herds, and the histories of that terrible season are full of what became of them. The abandonments, the relief trains met by riot, the counties that emptied westward the next summer and never refilled. This valley lost not one soul to hunger and not one farm to the spring foreclosures. Because there were no spring foreclosures, there was nothing left to foreclose with, and nobody who would have dared. And when the historical man with his notebooks asked old Ephraim Hollis, decades on, how one small district on the Solomon had come through the great winter hole when its neighbors broke, Hollis, who had buried his mill and his barn that year and counted himself lucky ever after, gave the answer that is on the stone now, and he gave it, they say, without 1 second's pause, as if he had been waiting 30 years for somebody to ask. He said, "We were fed from a kitchen we had spent 10 years laughing at." Then he said, "Write it down exactly." The break came the 2nd week of March, and it came the way it always comes on the plains, not gently, but all at once, a Chinook wind out of the southwest that ate the drifts like a hot spoon in sugar, and the river rose brown and loud under its rotten ice, and the roads went from iron to soup in 40 hours, and on the 19th of March. With half the town standing on the platform in mud to their bootlasses, the first locomotive in 3 weeks came down the opened line from the east, pushing a plume of steam that people said afterward looked like the flag of a relieving army, and behind it, coupled on by the railroad and the state together, were 2 cars of relief provisions for the starving districts of the Solomon country. Flour, beans, salt pork, seed wheat sent in answer to the winter's desperate telegraphed appeals. And here is the fact that made the newspapers as far away as Topeka and Kansas City. The fact that fixed this valley's story in the record for good, so that a historical man with a notebook was still driving out to ask about it 40 years on. When the Relief Committee opened its books on that platform to enroll the destitute of the Cedar Ford district, the district, gathered in its mud-caked wool, its faces wind-burnt, and its bodies 20 pounds lighter than October, looked at the committee, and looked at each other, and there was a long, strange, wonderful pause. And then Ephraim Hollis, as chairman of what the winter had made of the old Grange, stepped up to the table and said that the committee was kindly thanked, and the seed wheat would be taken with gratitude, every bushel, but that as to provisions, the committee had best carry them up the line to Bull City or down to Cocker, where the need was real, because this district, he said, and the men behind him stood a little straighter as he said it, this district had eaten regular all winter. The relief man, they say, looked over that crowd of gaunt, upright people refusing food in March, with the mud of the worst winter in Kansas history on their boots, and asked the natural question, which was how. And Hollis turned around and looked back through the crowd, and the crowd did what it had done in the church in January. It turned, all of it, one slow wave of weather-beaten faces, toward a very large woman in a made-over blue dress standing well back by the depot wall with her husband, holding, because she had walked down to meet the train like everybody else, a basket of her own bread for the train crews, and Hollis said, into the quiet, there stands Howe, and the platform, that same platform where this county had done 10 years of its cheap laughing, that platform began. One pair of raw chapped hands at a time, to applaud, and the applause did not stop for a long time, and Marta Rourke, who had stood level under a decade of mockery without letting them see her flinch, stood under the clapping exactly as long as she could bear it, which those closest swore was under half a minute, and then held up the basket and said, in her ordinary voice, that this was all very fine, but the bread was for the engine crew, who had been shoveling snow since Christmas and were the only people present who had actually earned it, and in the laugh that followed, the first whole-hearted laugh of that valley's new age, the first laugh in 10 years that had her inside it and not underneath it, the great winter may fairly be said to have ended. Spring did what spring does. The seed wheat went in late, but it went in everywhere. On farms that by every law of arithmetic should have been standing empty, worked by families that by every law of that terrible season should have been gone west or gone under, and were not, and knew why they were not, and the knowing changed the shape of that town permanently, the way a flood changes a river channel. The county paper, the same paper that had made its little fun of the cattle king turned swineherd and his wife's 8 tons of salt, printed in its first April number a piece that the editor, to his lasting credit, set inside a black border like a notice of death, because, he wrote, it was one. It was the obituary of a joke, and in it he set out the whole accounting, as Miss Finch's ledgers and the smokehouse door tallies proved it, the pounds cured and the pounds distributed, the 412 bakings, the family's provision twice a week for 11 weeks, the sum of salt advanced and the sum repaid, which was, characteristically, marked in her own hand, paid in full by Table 6 and others. And the editor ended the piece with 2 sentences that the old people of that county could still recite when the next century was well begun. She told this district in October what the winter would ask of it, and this district laughed, and she then spent that same winter answering the question herself, for all of us, at her own fire, from her own stores, with her own hands. We were warned by her, saved by her, and fed by her, and the files of this newspaper stand witness that we mocked her for all 3. And this number is printed in the hope that the files may also stand witness that we knew it, and said so, while she was alive to read it. She read it. Sophie was in the kitchen when she read it, and reported that her sister read it through twice, folded the paper, looked out the window at the wet black fields a while, and then said that it was handsomely done, and that the editor wanted feeding, he was thin as his own newsprint, and that was every word of ceremony Marta Rourke ever spent on her own vindication, because by then the vindication itself was simply another delivered load, entered, checked, and done with, and the woman had bread rising. But the valley was not done with its ceremony, and the valley, for once in this long story, got its ceremony exactly right, and it takes some telling, because it happened under lanterns, in October, in a new raised barn, 4 years almost to the night from the sentence this whole account began with, and if you have wondered why an old county kept this story polished and passed it down so carefully all these years, wonder no more, because a town that has behaved badly and knows it will hold on to the one night it fully repented the way a family holds the deed to its land. Through that summer of 1886, on the benchland where the Hollis barn had stood before the fire, The district raised a new barn, bigger than the old, every township sending crews to the raisings the way they had sent them to the fire lines and the cutting tables, timber hauled on the reopened railroad and paid for. In a fine turn nobody missed. Partly out of a subscription that Horace Callum opened with the largest single pledge of his tight-fisted life, and by the first week of October, the new Hollis barn stood red and enormous over the river valley with its paint hardly dry. And the notice that went up at Pratt's store and the church door in Miss Finch's proudest hand read, Harvest Dance, Saturday the 9th of October. At Hollis's new barn, all the township invited. Supper at 9, music by Mr. Spears and Sons. And then, underneath, in letters larger than all the rest, 4 words that told the whole county exactly what that evening was convened to be, and the 4 words were, in honor of Mrs. Rourke, she did not want to go. It is one of the treasured comic passages of the family record, faithfully preserved by Sophie, that the woman who had stood level before prairie fire, famine, and the united mockery of a county spent the week before that dance inventing chores, and proposed on the Thursday that she ought really to stay home with a sick sow, and was informed by her husband in the longest speech anyone ever heard him make on a light subject, that the sow was healthier than the governor of Kansas, that the county had raised a barn largely in order to put her in the middle of it, that he had been given his instructions by the committee and was more afraid of Delia Hollis than of his wife, a plain lie, and that the blue dress was already brushed and hanging on the door, and so, on the evening of the 9th of October, 1886, 4 years and 2 days from the night a drunken young man had told 4 townships that no one dances with the fat sister, Marta Rourke rode up the Benchland Road beside Gideon Rourke in the buggy, in the blue dress with her mother's lace at the throat, to the new barn standing in its blaze of lanterns on the prairie like a lighthouse on a dark sea, and half of 3 counties was inside it. And when she came through the great door with a cake in her arms, because you could sooner have parted her from her shadow than gotten her through any door in Kansas without food for the table, the fiddle stopped, and the caller stopped, and the whole barn turned, and Old Man Spears stood up on the new hay bale stage and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, she is here." And what happened then was not applause, or not only, it was the sound a town makes when it has been waiting a year to say something for which there are no adequate words, and says it anyway, all at once, with its hands and its boots and its throat, and it went on so long that the lantern swung with it, and through all of it Marta Rourke stood in the doorway holding her cake. And the cake was seen to tremble, at last, one time, before witnesses, and Mrs. Prucher relieved her of it with the smooth mercy of an old ally, so that whatever the big woman's hands did next, they would not do it to the frosting. The supper that night was laid on by the whole township expressly so that she would not lift a finger at it, an ambition at which the township failed inside 40 minutes. But it is the part just after supper that the county carried forward all those years, and here it is, told the way the old people told it, because their telling had had the corners worn smooth and true. Just after supper, before the dancing resumed, Roy Callum walked out alone into the middle of the new floor, where the whole barn could see him, the same position on the same compass point of a floor 90 feet from the same north wall, and he stood there until the room went quiet, which it did quickly. Because everybody knew every count of what stood in the middle of that floor, and he was not drunk, he had not, it was said, taken a drink since January, and he took his hat off, and held it in both hands, turning it, and then he said his piece. And though 60 years of retelling have surely planed and polished it, all the tellings agree on its bones. He said that 4 years ago, on this same night of the year, in the old barn, he had said a thing that everybody present had heard, or heard of, and that he had come tonight to take it back in front of the same county he had said it in front of, because his mother had raised him that a thing broken in public wants mending in public. He said he had spent 6 weeks that winter at a cutting table, learning his letters over again from the beginning, the real letters, the ones his schooling had skipped, and that the hand that taught him had every right to strike him and had instead fed him, and fed his father, and fed every soul under that roof, and kept the county in her ledger like her own children, The same county, he said. And here he had to stop a moment. The same county that had let him say what he said for 10 years because it was easier to laugh along than to tell the land agent's son to shut his mouth, and I include every man of you in that, he said, and myself twice over. And then he turned to the north side, to where she sat, and the tellings agree that his voice went unsteady, but his words did not. And he said, Mrs. Rourke, 4 years ago I stood on this spot of a floor that burned, and said that no one dances with the fat sister. And I am here to tell this county that I have thought about that sentence every day of this winter past, at your table, eating your bread, and the shame of it will keep me honest the rest of my life. And I ask your pardon, and I ask it out loud. And I will not dance a step tonight until you have answered, and it does not need to be yes. Neighbors, the barn did not breathe. And Martha Rourke sat still a moment on the north bench, the same body on the same plank compass point of the same wall as every mocked October of her 20s, and then she rose, all of her, slow and broad and unhurried, the way a barge answers its tow. And she crossed her half of that 90 feet as he had crossed his, and she looked up at the young man standing bareheaded with his hat wrung in his hands, and 4 townships leaned in to hear the fat sister render her verdict, and she said, in that voice that had said next, and mind your thumb all winter, the voice that never rose because it never needed to, Roy Callum, I forgave you at table 6. I have merely been waiting for you to catch up, and while the barn was still roaring at that, while Spears was scrambling his sons up for the music, she did the thing that put the roof on the story for good. The grace note no account of that county ever afterward left out. She held out her hand to Roy Callum and said, They tell me no one dances with the fat sister. And Roy Callum, weeping openly in front of 4 townships and past caring who saw, took her hand, and the fiddles came in like sunrise, and the author of the joke danced its first burial dance with the woman it had been aimed at for 10 years, and the whole county poured onto the floor around them, and somewhere in that crowd Ingrid married that June and radiant, and nobody's queen anymore, by her own glad. Abdication, danced with her husband and cried without one thought for her lashes, and Sophie danced with her father. And the new barn shook on its new sills, and at the center of all of it, presently, by the operation of the natural law that had governed him since a salt barrel in Pratt's store 5 years before, the crowd delivered her back to Gideon Rourke, and took itself considerately elsewhere, and the tall grave man and the big bright-faced woman turned slowly at the heart of the light and the music and the whole forgiven county. And what they said to each other inside that noise was theirs, and stayed theirs in the county, which had finally learned the difference between watching a person and seeing one, let it stay theirs, and that. Neighbors, that night, 4 years and 2 days from the cruelest sentence ever spoken in a Cedar Ford barn, is where the story the old people actually told always ended, with the 2 of them turning under the lanterns, and so it is where this telling will pause too, before the last accounting, the one that runs to the end of their days, because a story owes you its ending. And this one's ending is worth the last mile. The last accounting, then, kept the way she would have kept it, plainly in order, nothing wasted. Martha and Gideon Rourke were married 38 years, and they raised 2 children in the Stone house, a son, Lars, who ranched that ground all his life and was known over 4 counties for 2 things, his stock and his table, and a daughter, Karen, who took the Gray Ledger's successor volumes with her when she went east to study and became, in a new century her mother had cooked her way toward without knowing it, a teacher of what the colleges had begun calling domestic science, and who opened her first lecture every autumn, her students recorded, with the same sentence, "My mother was the finest engineer I ever knew, and she worked in salt and smoke." The Stone smokehouse fed more than its own valley twice again. In the grasshopper summer of 1892, carried food east by wagon to districts that had none. And in the hard winter after the panic of 1893, when the trains ran full of tramping men and the whole country was hungry in a new modern way that no plow could answer, and the rule of that house never changed in all its years, the rule the district could have recited asleep. Nobody leaves this yard empty-handed, and nobody eats alone at this door. The great saving itself passed in time from memory into institution. The way all live things calcify, the Grange took formal charge of the district provision lists. The county built proper storehouses. The state took note of the Cedar Ford system, as the bulletins called it, farm-by-farm accounting, provision by list and not by asking, and recommended it by circular across the drought counties, with no woman's name anywhere in the circular, of course the state being the state, but the valley knew whose square hand was under all that officialdom and never let its children forget it, and that is in fact how this story survived for you to hear it, not through the newspapers, which yellow, and not through the circulars, which nobody ever read twice, but through 60 years of kitchen table telling, grandmother to grandchild, the Kansas way, the only archive that never burns. Roy Callum kept every promise that January made him. He ran the land office after his father with a decency that would have astonished his own younger self, sat 20 years on the District Relief Committee, refused all his life to let any man in his hearing get started on any woman's body in any barroom, having personally retired the county's taste for that particular music, and when he died, old, in the 1930s, his instructions were found to include a bequest to the Grange for the maintenance in perpetuity of what the instrument called the Harvest Dance Supper Table, in memory of a lady who taught me my letters at Table 6, and the supper at the Cedar Ford Harvest Dance is paid for out of that money to this day, which means, if you follow it, that the author of the joke has been quietly setting her table for 90 years. Gideon Rourke died in the spring of 1921, in his 74th year, in the stone house with his wife's hand in his, and the county came to that funeral from as far as trains run, and the men who had ridden his fire lines and worked his cutting tables stood at the grave with their hats in their hands like a stand of winter timber, and at the supper afterward, which she cooked, being who she was, over the protest of every woman in the district. Marta was heard to say the only public sentence she ever spent on her own marriage, when a well-meaning visitor offered her the comfortable saying that she had been lucky in him. She was buttering bread as she answered, and she did not look up, and she said, "We were not lucky. We were paying attention, and the whole kitchen went quiet the way the barn had gone quiet twice in this story, because ordinary words had just closed over something enormous. And that is as good a definition of that woman as this account can leave you. She outlived him 11 years in the stone house with her son's family around her, baking Saturdays to the end, and she died in January of 1932. In the middle of a hard winter, of course. She would never have consented to die in a soft one. And she was in her 76th year, and the county buried her beside her husband on the benchland in sight of where 2 Hollis barns had stood. In a February ground her neighbors' grandsons broke with picks out of a debt their grandfathers had explained to them, and the stone they set is still there, and people still drive out to it, and it says what the district voted over the family's mild objection that it should say. Marta Jensen Rourke. She told us what winter asks. She was right, and we laughed, and she fed us anyway. And underneath, small, in Danish, the proverb her daughter chose, the dogs bark, and the wagon goes on. Now the fire is getting low, and you have listened a long while, so let the last words be the ones this story has been carrying toward all evening. The ones Sophie, white-haired, used to end with when the grandchildren asked for the fat sister story one more time, and there was always one more time. She would say, "Understand what it was we nearly wasted." She would say, "My sister lived 26 years in the middle of us, the woman nobody wanted at their table, the woman no man would cross a floor for, and the whole time, children, everything that saved this valley was already in her, the salt and the smoke and the ledger and the level head and the hands that never hurried and the heart that fed its own mockers without once keeping score, all of it. Sitting on the north bench in a made-over dress, dance after dance after dance, while we looked straight at her and saw nothing but a joke about a doorway. And one man looked and saw the harvest. That was all he did. Children, the famous walk was only looking, done out loud. And then Sophie would bank the stove and send them up to bed with the ending, and it is your ending too, so take it with you. In every town there is a north bench, and there is somebody sitting on it, and the town has told itself a joke about them so long it has forgotten it is a joke, and the winter that is coming. And neighbors, some winter is always coming. The winter knows exactly who they are, even if the town has never once truly looked, and so the whole art of living in a town, the whole of it, children, everything your grandmother knows boiled down into one Saturday sentence, is to look before the winter makes you, because the ones who laughed at the big woman at the harvest dance spent the rest of their lives grateful beyond the reach of words that when their hard season came over the ridge at last, she had wasted none of her 26 years on being bitter, and every one of them on being ready, and that when the whole county finally came up her lane through the snow, hungry, ashamed, and late, the woman they had never once asked to dance opened her door and looked out at all those laughing faces gone quiet, and said only, and forever, in the voice that never needed to rise, "You are late. There are aprons on the rail, and the winter is long, and there is work in this kitchen for every hand." And nobody in that valley, from that night to this, ever told that joke again.